So first of all, before we get into the recipes, let's talk about the positioning of the lights within the facility. Whether you're working in studio, on location, it doesn't matter. I've developed a technique called the clock and compass, which allows anybody to duplicate and guarantee those results, whether they're an assistant who's just begun working for me, or whether they're a hardened pro and we're working on location in the deepest, darkest Africa, I only wish. But as far as the clock is concerned, we've got to imagine that the subject is always in the middle of the dial, and the camera is always at the 6 o'clock position. As long as we keep those two as our standard, we then know where to position our lights. Now, the classic position for a headshot photograph in a classic way would be that the main light source is becoming between the 4 and the 5 o'clock position. Or, if the light was on the camera left, it would be at the 7 to the 8 o'clock position, either directly pointing at the subject or feathered, which means it kind of washes across them. For the more flat-on clamshell style of photography, the main light source is going to be above camera position and coming down straight towards them. So in other words, the light is at the 6 o'clock. When we talk about a background light, it's usually in the 12 o'clock position. So in other words, situated behind the subject, or it could be a 12 o'clock high if it was being used for a hair light, where the light is above the background and pointing back towards camera position to light and separate the subject away from the background by spilling onto their shoulders and hair. Then we have separation lights, where we're looking at the 1 o'clock position or the 11 o'clock position, and those will actually again separate the subject to create the kind of the basics of a three-dimensional subject, no matter what style we're working with. But what we've got to remember all the time, as soon as the key light moves, it will drastically change what is going on as far as how it lights the subject is concerned. We want to be aware that when we're lighting the subject with that 6 o'clock position, that clamshell style where they're coming onto them, it's going to make the face fuller. So we might need to subtract some of the light, or we might need to actually remove the reflector a little bit or control the reflector's position. So lots of little things, but as far as the lighting is concerned, when I'm referring to a light position, you'll know now exactly where it's positioned on the clock, so you'll be able to repeat the recipe without any problem. So I've got a quick cheat that will really help you move between a classic image and a creative image without really doing big changes in your lighting setups, and it's using the ISO game. Basically, when I want a big aperture, like the f8 for the classic styles, I'm going to be working on 400 ISO. And if I want to straight away move to a f4 for a creative aperture style of shot, then basically all I need to do then is just reduce down my ISO to 100. The 100 to 400 ISO is 2 stops, of course. The difference between f4 and f8 is 2 stops, so it works perfectly in synergy. So you can really move quite fast between, as I said, that classic shot and the creative depth of field without any other work except by just playing that ISO game. So when I'm setting up any of the work in here, I'm always setting up on 400 ISO to begin with, allowing me at any stage to drop back down. Obviously, if your camera quality doesn't really react well at 400 ISO, I don't know of one that does nowadays, but obviously you'd need to actually shoot a little bit lower. Or if your camera starts at its ISO at 200 of course, you would then meter at 800 ISO, which gives you that extra stop. So use the ISO to quickly move your depth of field from the likes of f8 to f4 just by using the different ISOs from 400 ISO to 100 ISO. So the high key basic is looking at the background light being twice as bright as the main light source. Why do we need it twice as bright? Well, we need white with no detail, otherwise we're going to have to do some work within Photoshop. So classically, we're either going to use a light onto a white wall background to illuminate it to give me 2 stops brighter than the working aperture, or I'm going to use, if in studio working in a portable location where I don't know I've got a white wall, with the likes of the highlight, so I can illuminate it to actually create that pure white background, or of course a pop-up background or a white paper. Whatever style you're going for, you're going to need to have something light and bright to begin with so you can clean it up. So the classic, basic, high key aperture is f8 on camera, which means our key light needs to be metered to f8 from the subject's face to the light source, and then the background light needs to be set 2 stops more, so it will create us an f16 reading Guaranteed getting the results. Now, because we've got that backlight coming through, we don't need any other separation light. We don't really need hair light or anything, because it's going to pretty much actually spill around the subject anyway. The more care we take in setting up the most difficult scenario, i.e. high key, the absolutely minimal time you're going to spend in the lights of the post-production. For the creative high key image, of course, style 2, all I really need to do now is just use that ISO gain. Okay, if we've done it all right based on 400 ISO f8 for the classic shot, all I need to do now is change my ISO on camera to 100 ISO, and then I can change my aperture on camera to f4, and basically I'm ready to rock straight away. You've got to remember when you're using the creative style, of course, to focus on the eye. That's the key thing there to allow for that good depth of field. And so straight away you've gone from a subject with good depth of field to a creative depth of field in seconds. For our mid-key basic style 3, all we need to do really is switch the background light off. So if we've got a white wall behind or a white material behind, basically if it's unlit, it's going to go grey no matter what. Now that's kind of done. So we could use grey paper, we could use white unlit backgrounds. You're going to find if you're using a form of grey paper though, it's going to go darker, and you're going to start to move more into the darker low key style than you are in the mid key. When we refer to mid-key, it's basically in the midpoint of the grey tonality. High key is in the higher plane of grey, low key is going to be in the lower plane of grey. So mid-key is this 18%-ish unlit white background that will give us this look. The problem if we just switch off the background light itself and we don't do anything else is that the subject, no matter what aperture we're using, will start to look a little bit flat onto the photograph itself. So we need a separation light. And this is where we would start to actually bring a separation light on the opposite side. So if my key light is working at the 4 to 5 o'clock position, then my separation light would be at the 10 to 11 o'clock position. For mid-key creative, of course, I'm playing that ISO gain once again, straight away dropping from 400 ISO to 100 ISO, swapping my aperture from f8 to f4. That gives me that great depth of field from nose to the front of the ear. I can guarantee the sharpness there if I focused on the eye, guaranteed. But then I'll usually use the separation light on the opposite side. So in other words, I create a bit more of a sandwich lighting technique, which is the key light running at, say, the 4 to 5 o'clock position, and then the separation light is running at the 10 to 11 o'clock position. So the subject's in the middle of the light pool, but making sure, again, that separation light is still that 2 stops less than the working aperture itself. So for my low-key basic, I opt for a darker grey background or a black background. Makes the technique so simple. I'm still going to work with my key light at the 4 to 5 o'clock position or the 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock position. That gives me that 45-degree kind of direction, give me a good catch light within the eye and so on. But we need to separate the subject more than ever before. So this is where we can decide to either use 1 separation light or 2 separation lights. Now for my classic 2 separation, it would be a light at the 11 to 10 o'clock position, yeah, on the left-hand side of camera, and another one to the 1 to the 2 o'clock position. I opt for strip boxes just to control the light so it doesn't spill all over the place. But once more, both of those are set for 2 stops less than the actual low-key image itself. For our creative low-key, guess what? All we're doing is changing through the ISO game, pretty much keeping in the same style and just keeping that sandwich lighting technique, and perhaps that light from overhead if I need to as well, or just go into a 2 light setup, which can be obviously the main light source as we discussed, and then with actually a light above. So it again still gives us that kind of creative depth of field and a different look and feel to the photograph as well. We can always tilt, in fact, if we're using the light above, we can tilt it not just onto the hair, but also to spill onto the background just a little bit to give us a subtle illumination onto the background. Depends how close we are working to that background, of course. But that's another way to actually change your creative low-key as well. The classic old master shot is still probably my favorite. It's still built on the same techniques that we've been discussing, but it's using a cloth background or a painted canvas of some kind. If you're using a darker canvas, without any real radial lightness in it, you're going to have to use a background light in this setup as well. I tend to actually use the classic Old Master background by Last Light by Manfrotto, this pop-up background now, which is just brilliant for headshots. And the reason for doing that, it naturally has a radiation within the middle, so it's lighter to dark, so I instantly get this Old Master look and feel. But if I was using a curtain background, as I said, I'd probably actually be using a light behind the subjects. Let's talk about that though. So the classic 45-degree light position, good depth of field, f8 again, separation light from the same side as the main light source. So if the main light source is at the 4 to 5 o'clock position, the separation light would be at the 1 to 2 o'clock position. That's the classic positions for it, okay? Obviously then we've got to illuminate that background because it's going to go really dark. So, and if there's some light spilling on onto it, or we're working in a small space, that's fine, because you're going to naturally allow some of the softbox light to illuminate that background anyway. However, as I said, if you do need to bring a little bit of illumination to it, you're going to have to put a background light behind the subject. And what I would suggest to you is starting initially on minimum power on your lighting, because obviously I don't know what lights you use, and then gradually turning it up by a stop at a time to make sure you're getting to the kind of the look and the feel. As soon as you know the kind of the look that you want, then make a note of it, because we can use the meter as a reflective meter from the back of the subject towards the background, but you're not really going to get a correct reading on that. If I had the spot meter option for this meter, then I could read onto the background itself to actually get a perfect exposure level, but I never really want that background to compete with the subject's face. So once more, traditionally, it's around about a stop and a half to 2 stops less than the working aperture is what we're trying to aim for. If it's too bright, they're going to look like they're on fire behind. If it's too dark, then you're really going into a little bit more of a kind of a low-key, kind of really classical master, but you've got to be aware about blocking the blacks up when these things go to print. It's not so bad for web, but if anything's going to print in a magazine, then basically you could have a big problem and you might not get paid for that. My 8th style is the editorial look. This is where I'm using a little bit more of an f4 to 5.6 aperture. I might have the subject lean in more. I might have the subject lean in onto a wall, but it's really about the position of the light, to be honest. It's kind of coming in more from the 3 or 4 o'clock position with an exaggerated tilt of the head or the turn of the head, or of course on the opposite side at the 9 to 8 o'clock position, and then having a little bit more light coming back towards the camera for the separation, allowing it to spill just a little bit more. Remember, control that power, otherwise it's going to bleach out the texture of the skin and you're going to have a real problem anyway with that. So as far as the editorial look is concerned, it does involve a little bit more light kind of spilling back towards camera, not to actually add any flare, but to add a little bit of kind of spill of the light coming onto the subjects themselves. It could even be the likes of lighting a big white wall behind the subject and just using a reflector in front to give them some illumination, as if it's like a big window light coming in from behind and you're bouncing the light back and so on. So there's many ways to create it, or working with kind of gobos where the light is passing through the likes of cardboard or whatever to disrupt the light source to get a little bit more kind of creativity within the image itself. And my 9th but no means last style is the model modern creative. So this is giving us a little bit more of a fashion style of photograph, a little bit more edgier in the black and white perhaps, using harder light sources, even ring flash, to kind of create the image. The subject could be flat onto a paper background, using the ring flash to create very dynamic images. Specifically, if I was having to shoot for a corporate look and they wanted something a little bit fresh, we can get the right color background in to suit them, and then the ring flash is giving us this kind of dynamic image. We could be using the big softbox as the main light source, and then perhaps popping on a smaller light in front of camera with a honeycomb to illuminate the face, to just make the face pop a little bit more. And if that's the style, then we'd actually make sure that the honeycomb light is just set a 3rd stop brighter than the key light to make the face really punch out. So as far as the modern model creative, this is where you can bring your skills to town, bit of fun, and you can kind of make it up, change and play with different kind of backgrounds, reflective backgrounds, darker backgrounds, pattern backgrounds, out of focus background. You know, this is really down to you to kind of play your own game, but to make sure that you can kind of mimic it time after time within a small studio space or working on location. Things like foil blankets are absolutely ideal to actually pin up in a client's office or home to get this kind of real shimmer kind of styling. Add some gel to that, and all of a sudden it's a completely different kind of creative photograph from the kind of the basic with it. We can even add gels onto our main light sources or our separation light sources to create that little bit more of a funky kind of look. But that's your creative image, and you've got to find that right kind of styling for the client, of course. So those are the 9 styles that we've talked about.